Welcome to Shadowline News, your gateway to global headlines and local updates. Let's now turn to our next story. Pro-Palestine protesters condemn Israel's Eurovision performance. Protesters were assaulted and dragged away for shouting, "Free Palestine," during Israel and #039's performance at Eurovision. In other news, Israel kills 130 Palestinians in a matter of hours as Gaza talks resume. Israel's intensified attacks on Gaza have killed more than 130 Palestinians in a matter of hours. Here's what else is making headlines. Leaders attend Pope Leo XIV's inaugural Mass, including Zelensky and Vance. Pope Leo XIV condemned hatred, prejudice and exploitation of the earth and poor during his inauguration Mass. Moving on to the next development. India's space agency suffers setback as it fails to launch satellite. Attempt to place satellite into orbit fails after launch vehicle encountered a technical issue, ISRO chief says. And now, our next story. Inmates escape New Orleans jail through hole behind toilet. Surveillance footage shows the moment 10 prisoners broke out of jail in New Orleans. Let's now turn to our next story. At least 10 reported killed in suicide bomb blast in Somalia's Mogadishu. Suicide bomber targets queue of young recruits registering at a military base in the capital. In other news, Indian professor arrested over social media post on military operation. Ali Khan Mahmoodabad from Ashoka University held after complaint filed by a youth leader of the ruling BJP. Here's what else is making headlines. Portugal holds its third elections in 3 years. Immigration and cost of living crisis on voters and #039 minds as they head to polling booths to elect the next government. Moving on to the next development. Trump's tariffs are failing. But the old model won't save us either. Trade wars won't save workers. A new economic order can. And now, our next story. Sufficient law exists for United Nations to end genocide in Gaza. Noura Erakat, a human rights attorney, urged UN states to use their powers to end Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. Let's now turn to our next story. Could AI help elderly people and refugees reconstruct unrecorded pasts? How a studio in Barcelona is using artificial intelligence to create an #039 synthetic memories and #039 where no visual records exist. In other news, Poland votes in tight presidential election. Foreign policy under Prime Minister Donald Tusk. LGBTQ rights and abortion have been major issues on the campaign trail. Here's what else is making headlines. Gaza's children are stronger than adults, but can't fight hunger. Volunteer Afid Nasuli says that the small joys Gaza's kids find can and #039 mask the toll of hunger. Moving on to the next development. Mexican Navy sailing ship crashes into Brooklyn Bridge in New York. Videos show the moment a Mexican Navy training ship crashed into New York's Brooklyn Bridge. And now, our next story. Pro-Palestinian protesters rally around the world to mark Nakba Day. Tens of thousands of people stage mass protests worldwide to mark 77 years of Palestinians' dispossession. Let's now turn to our next story. Children among 132 Palestinians killed in Israeli barrage across Gaza. The Israeli military has killed hundreds of Palestinians in the past few days as it expands its ground invasion. In other news, week in pictures. From deadly storms in US to forced displacement in Gaza. A roundup of some of last week's events. Here's what else is making headlines. Bomb hits California reproductive health clinic which FBI calls terrorism. Video shows aftermath of an explosion outside a fertility clinic in Palm Springs. California that killed one person. Moving on to the next development. Romania election. George Simeon and Nikisa Dan face off in tense runoff. The election result could reshape the direction of the pro-EU and NATO member nation bordering war-torn Ukraine. And now, our next story. Mexican Navy ship crashes into New York's Brooklyn Bridge, killing 2 people. New York City Mayor Eric Adams says 19 others were injured in the collision, but the bridge spared major damage. Let's now turn to our next story. How to achieve a lasting ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. A Russian drone strike hit Ukraine and #039's Sumy region hours after first direct talks in 3 years. In other news, FBI calls explosion near California fertility clinic in act of terrorism. Palm Springs Police Chief Andy Mills says the blast appears to be an intentional act of violence. Here's what else is making headlines. Fight back. Pedro Pascal urges Cannes to resist U.S. political pressure. Actor calls on filmmakers to and #039. Keep telling the stories. Keep expressing yourself and keep fighting to be who you are and #039. Moving on to the next development. At least 3 killed as Syrian forces raid ISIL hideouts in Aleppo. Syrian authorities say 3 ISIL fighters killed and several others detained in Aleppo raids. And now, our next story. FA Cup Final 2025. Crystal Palace defeat Man City in major upset. Crystal Palace win their first major trophy by beating Manchester City 1-0 in the FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium. Let's now turn to our next story. Israeli forces besiege Gaza hospital as Hamas offers truce terms. Israel has laid out conditions which could bring about the end of the war. In other news, 2 dead as Mexican Navy ship crashes into Brooklyn Bridge. 19 people also injured after masts of training sail vessel hit New York City Bridge. Here's what else is making headlines. Pope to meet Zelensky after inauguration mass. Vatican says Pope would meet Zelensky in private to discuss the war in Ukraine following inauguration. Moving on to the next development. Minister pushing for deal over use of EU passport e-gates. The deal could form part of negotiations taking place between the UK and EU on Monday. And now, our next story. Watch. Soreness. Espresso and null points. A look back at Eurovision 2025. A nail-biting finish saw Austrian singer JJ win the contest in Switzerland at the very last minute. Thank you for tuning in to Shadowline News. Stay informed. Stay ahead. See you next time.